Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Liz, and I'm pleased you've decided to join me on the very first episode of Truck Talk with Liz. I am sitting here with a peaceful view of the winter roads ahead, and we'll be heading north from Thessaloniki all the way to Lillehammer. As we progress, I'll share thoughts on all sorts of topics, particularly one that I find especially fascinating, which is the nature of animal consciousness. That might sound like a hefty subject, but I promise it'll be a calm, meandering conversation. That also includes short digressions about the places that we will see along the way. I personally believe in a spirit of mutual care and shared respect in society, something that influences how I see every living creature of any kind, but I like to let that outlook remain gentle in these talks. I'll try to never push it in a heavy-handed way. Instead, I'll just invite you to relax and listen as we journey ahead. I'd also like to let you know that this is an ongoing series, and every new drive will bring a topic of its own. Today, we begin by considering some age-old questions. Which animals are conscious? What does consciousness mean in that context? How do we find out? These are questions that cross the boundaries between science and philosophy. There's an element that demands careful study. Behavioral observations, neurological data, and another that ventures into ideas about the nature of experience itself. We'll look into all that in a steady, straightforward manner. I also thought it would be nice to share a little bit about myself. This is my first time making a recorded series, though I've long had a fondness for chatting during road trips with friends and family. My approach is calm, perhaps a bit unhurried. I am definitely partial to letting conversations drift into deeper territory if people are willing to join me there. I hope you'll find some enjoyment and relaxation with the thoughts that I share, even if they wander here and there. Before we talk about the finer points of animal consciousness, I want to briefly outline our route. Please forgive me on any mispronunciations. I am a foreigner. We begin in Thessaloniki, a vibrant city known for its layered history. Then we pass the Thessaloniki cement plant, which might seem mundane at first, but it is a reminder of how many industrial sites line the roads that weave across Europe. Shortly after, we'll move on towards Kavala and its pleasant marina, glimpsing the sea's winter sparkle. Then we cross into Bulgaria, seeing Pernik and its steelworks, then Sofia, followed by Serbia, Niš, Prokupiye, Pristina and its center, onto Kragujevac, then Belgrade, near the Goravica Wind Park, and finally Novi Sad. After that, we push into Hungary, passing Szeged, Kecskemét, Budapest, Győr, then into Austria at Vienna, then Stockerau, next up Czechia, Brno. We head into Poland via Gorzów Wielkopolski, Szczecin and Świnoujście, and from there we'll make our way to Sweden through Trelleborg, Malmö, Helsingborg, Gothenburg, and into Norway with Oslo, Hamar, and finally reaching Lillehammer. This long path provides ample time for conversation. Let me give a quick preview. I plan to share a concise introduction to the debates about animal consciousness, including the scientific side and the philosophical side. We'll look at what exactly we mean by consciousness, how it might have evolved, and how it might be distributed across the animal kingdom. I find these questions gently weave themselves into concerns about empathy, moral standing, and how we relate to other species. But let us not rush. First, let's pause to appreciate where we are. Thessaloniki. It's a city that in many ways blends antiquity with modern urban life. If you ever walk its streets, you'll stumble upon remnants of Byzantine architecture, Roman ruins, and vibrant neighborhoods with lively people going about their day. Here in winter, there's a crispness in the air. Some might find it cold, but I like the freshness, something about the feeling of renewal that winter often brings. we pass the Thessaloniki cement plant, I am reminded of all the complex ways humans transform natural materials. Cement is something we take for granted, but it's a modern cornerstone for building and expansion. My personal outlook is that we could do well to weigh our building activities against the well-being of creatures who share our planet. That's part of what shapes my perspective, the recognition that we're all on this shared ground. Simple stops like these can bring thoughts of how we're all connected, human and non-human life. Now, let's begin our main conversation, animal consciousness. To set the stage, I often start by clarifying that the concept of consciousness itself is complex. When we talk about whether animals are conscious, we are generally interested in whether they have subjective experiences, sometimes phrased as what it's like to be that animal. Philosophers put this as, if a creature experiences emotions, pain, or any sort of inner world, that creature is conscious in the sense that matters here. But we might also consider simpler notions. An animal can be said to be conscious in one sense if it's awake rather than asleep, or if it perceives surroundings in some way. Those simpler concepts, wakefulness, basic awareness, are fairly uncontroversial. Pretty much anyone observing an animal would say it's conscious, in the sense of being awake or responding to stimuli. It's a deeper question to wonder if it feels its experiences in a subjective way. But let's hold that thought for a moment. We are arriving near Kavala, with its characteristic seafront. In the cooler seasons, the smell of salt water can be sharp, and the horizon sometimes appears fairly outlined against the softer winter sky. Kavala Marina might still have some fishing boats gently rocking, though fewer than in the summer. When I see waters like that, I'm reminded of the movement of fish, always hidden below the surface. That's fitting, because fish consciousness is itself a contested subject. Some scientists argue fish feel pain and have subjective experiences. Others are skeptical, pointing to structural differences in fish brains compared to mammals, but we'll get deeper into that in a while. Kavala behind, we climb inland until eventually we reach Pernik in Bulgaria, home to the steelwork of Pernik, a testament to industrial development. Factories like these, in my mind, embody that intersection of progress, labor, and sometimes harsh conditions. I wonder how many people think about the living creatures in the vicinity when constructing and operating these large sites. It's not the sort of question that typically leaps to people's minds, but it does matter if we believe other animals have experiences, because then their environment holds meaning for them as well. Now, to approach the scientific dimension of animal consciousness. There's a widespread view that no purely philosophical reasoning will confirm which animals have subjective experiences. We need evidence from their behavior, their neurology, and their evolution too. Scientists often collect data on how animals learn, remember, and communicate. We can also look at the structures of their nervous systems, whether they resemble ours in ways that typically support conscious states in humans. That said, there is no universal agreement. For a long time, certain lines of thought insisted that animals lacked the rational, language-driven capacities that presumably define consciousness. The philosopher Descartes famously argued that animals were mere automata, complex structures that behaved in ways reminiscent of us but lacked genuine inner experiences. These days, few scientists hold this strict Cartesian view, but the legacy of that skepticism lingers, especially when we try to talk about whether simpler organisms like insects might have an inner life. We'll keep that in mind as we journey onwards. Approaching Sofia, Bulgaria's capital, I recall it as a place where ancient history meets modern city life, with lovely squares and wide boulevards. It's a spot that's grown in leaps over time, and in winter the sight of mountain vistas in the distance can be quite lovely. There's a hush in the city this time of year, and perhaps a bit more calmness if you venture into the quieter areas. Whenever I reflect on large urban centers, I can't help but think about pigeons, stray cats, and dogs navigating life among busy sidewalks. Are these animals conscious in the sense that we typically mean? Most of us would say yes to dogs, cats, and perhaps to some birds, especially if we've seen them show fear or affection. It's a daily demonstration that non-human species respond to the world in complicated ways. carry that thread into Serbia. Niš is a notable city with a long history, a place once touched by the Roman Empire. And if you press further, passing Procopije, you'll find smaller towns, sometimes a farmland vibe in winter hush. In the distance, there's Pristina, capital of Kosovo, and as we roll through the center of Pristina, you'll sense that mix of old and new structures, with people going about their routines. It's interesting how every city has its own unique atmosphere, shaped by countless generations. And now is a good moment to examine the philosophical side of animal consciousness more closely. Many thinkers emphasize that consciousness is private, subjective. For instance, if I feel pain, only I truly know what it's like. Others can observe my reactions or measure my brain activity, but the raw experience remains my own. This leads to what's called the problem of other minds. How do we really know any other being, human or not, truly feels something inside? If we can accept that we can know it in the case of other humans, some ask why we draw the line at animals. Why not assume that dogs, cats, even mice might similarly feel their existence? As we near Kragujevac, a Serbian city noted for its industrial background, I recall that certain industrial expansions have often forced animals out of their habitats. This raises moral concerns if we believe those animals experience frustration, fear, or the distress of displacement. After all, we wouldn't so casually treat conscious beings as if they were merely objects. moving on toward Belgrade, quite a significant city on the Danube, I think about the many animals that have historically lived along major rivers: fish, birds, and smaller mammals reliant on wetlands. The question of consciousness is never just academic. It informs how we treat these creatures, how we consider their interests. If you believe fish feel pain in a real subjective sense, that might shape your stance on fishing or aquaculture. If you believe birds have emotional states, you may consider city planning that preserves green belts where they can live. On that note, I'd like to share something that's been on my mind. I recently watched a film titled Queer, directed by Luca Guadagnino. It's actually adapted from a William S. Burroughs novel, and it features Daniel Craig as William Lee and Drew Starkey as Eugene Allerton. The film has a dreamlike mood, shifting from a depiction of desire and longing in a not quite period-accurate Mexico, all scored by anachronistic choices like Nirvana and Prince. I found it interesting how the film merges different time influences, completely ignoring standard historical signposts. The chemistry between Craig and Starkey is especially vivid, with each scene hinting at the universal human yearning for connection. There's also a surreal trip to Ecuador involving hallucinogens, reflecting Burroughs' own complicated personal legacy with substances. The part I enjoyed most was how Guadagnino created these phantom moments, like a double exposure effect, suggesting two characters nearly touching across a boundary. It reminded me of how intangible and subjective our mental experiences are. We see desire and love from Lee's perspective, but we can also recognize how ephemeral and elusive it all is. Despite some narrative weaknesses near the end, the emotional weight of the film lingers. It's both strange and absorbing, showing us how a single-minded focus, like Lee's obsession, can shape a person's consciousness. Watching it made me contemplate how even humans can be locked in a swirl of wants, vulnerabilities, and illusions that define their own inner states. And if that's the case for us, what might an animal's parallel experience be like in its own simpler or equally complex way? And with that thought, we pass by the Koravica Wind Park, modern wind turbines harnessing the breeze, a reminder that societies are seeking cleaner energy. Then we reach Novi Sad, with its fortress and vibrant cultural life. I wonder if we can appreciate the birds that often roost among such structures. Are they aware in ways akin to us, or are they functioning on pure instinct? The question is both fascinating and humbling. Next, we cross into Hungary, gliding past Szeked, soon Kecskemét, then the big highlight, Budapest. In winter, that city can be quite magical, especially around the Danube. One might see gatherings of starlings in mesmerizing patterns known as murmurations. In such displays, people often say it looks like the entire flock shares a collective awareness. Scientific studies show that birds and flocks respond in near unison, as if each bird is aware of minute changes in neighbor's flight. Some argue that this synergy suggests advanced cognitive function, while others maintain it's a set of reflexes honed by natural selection. Whatever the explanation, it's one of those phenomena that spark wonder about how animals experience the world. Leaving Budapest behind, we press on to Győr with scenic old streets. Then we cross into Austria, heading to Vienna, another place brimming with history. I recall how in Vienna's cathedrals and museums you sense a massive cultural heritage. At the same time, you might notice pigeons perched on statues, crows in the parks, wild creatures living right in the middle of human splendor. They have their own ways, possibly their own forms of memory. Indeed, crows and ravens have captured scientists' attention for their remarkable problem-solving skills, fueling debate about avian consciousness. Some research suggests crows can remember individual human faces and respond differently to them, which implies a certain level of awareness and memory integration. Continue out of the city towards Stockerau, then it's on to Czechia, approaching Brno, a hub of culture and education. Winter in Brno can be peaceful, with quiet squares and old stone buildings. With the roads less crowded, it's a chance to mull over how, historically, humans used to see themselves as profoundly separate from other animals. Now there's a growing acceptance of evolutionary continuity, the idea that humans are one branch of a grand tree of life. If we share so many bodily and behavioral traits with our close relatives, is it so surprising that we might share consciousness with them too? Of course, Not everyone believes consciousness is so widespread. Some theories claim that language or higher order thought is necessary for a being to be truly aware. If that's the case, perhaps only humans, and maybe a few advanced apes, qualify. But not every researcher agrees. Others think that if an animal can integrate sensory information, learn, and respond flexibly to new situations, that's enough reason to consider that it has an inner life. These debates will surely remain lively for a long time. Crossing the Polish border, we approach Gorzów Wielkopolski, then onward to Szczecin and Świnoujście, near the Baltic coast. That entire region can feel windswept and cold this time of year, with a stark beauty. It's an area that has changed national affiliation multiple times in history, signifying how humans draw lines in ways that nature ignores. Migration routes of birds or sea creatures pay no heed to such political boundaries. They simply follow their instincts or some sense of the environment. From Poland, we'll move on to the ferry route that brings us to Trelleborg in Sweden, then we head to Malmö. This entire region is known for modern design, wind farms at sea, and a forward-thinking attitude. The presence of water is near constant. Coastless lines, harbors. Wherever I'm near watery areas, I recall that fish, amphibians, and aquatic mammals make up a big portion of animal life on our Earth. Many have complex behaviors. Dolphins, for instance, show highly developed social structures. Some experts claim dolphins have a sense of self, evidenced by mirror tests. That could mean they experience themselves as individuals, an advanced form of consciousness. Sweden's western coast in winter is often brisk, with short days. You might see orcas in certain areas as they sometimes pass through local waters. That leads me to reflect. Orcas are known for their coordinated hunts and extended families. They communicate with distinct calls, pass on group traditions, and show signs of emotional capacity when members die or separate. This again begs the question, how does their perspective differ from ours? It must be unique, embedded in acoustic signals and movement through the depths of the ocean. Leaving Sweden behind, we finally enter Norway, heading towards Oslo. The city in winter is often dusted with snow, a place merging Nordic culture and modern architecture. Past that, we see Hamar, then it's a short hop further onto Lillehammer, renowned for winter sports, an alpine vibe, and scenic valleys. When we arrive there, we'll consider our conversation about consciousness more or less at its close for today. But let's not jump to the end just yet. There's more ground to cover. I want to shift a bit now. I recently caught a TV series called Dededede-Destruction. It's about two high school girls, Kadode and Oran, living in a world overshadowed by a massive alien spaceship above the city. The interesting part is how the show blends mundane teenage life, overbearing parents, romance, existential worries, with the presence of a literal alien threat hovering above. Much of it satirizes modern militarism and how society reacts to large-scale crises. The focus remains on the personal experiences of these characters, showing how even in the face of something cosmic, everyday friendships, joys, and sadness remain at the center of their consciousness. It's also unafraid to highlight heavy themes like genocide and the potential for humanity to commit dreadful acts. Despite that, it's often quite heartwarming and even funny, anchored by the bond between these two girls as they navigate growing up in a chaotic world. For me, it raised a parallel question. If we can accept that humans manage to maintain typical teenage concerns under an overshadowing crisis, maybe animals too can have their own micro-world of experiences, shaped by survival, but also containing nuance, memory, and moments of calm or joy. You see, discussions of animal consciousness often circle back to pain, but there's a broader concept of emotional states. Many scientists now study whether animals can be anxious, playful, or even depressed. The matter of play, especially, is intriguing. Animals like dolphins or young monkeys often engage in carefree frolicking that isn't purely a survival function. Some researchers view this as an indicator of a richer inner life. We can contrast that with more mechanical patterns of behavior, like reflex actions. Once you watch animals at play, you might feel it's not just mechanical reflex, it suggests some spark of pleasure or curiosity. Now, let's weave in the third piece of media I recently experienced, Elif Shafak's There Are Rivers in the Sky. It's a novel that revolves around water politics, following multiple characters in different eras. One focus is the story of a Yazidi girl named Narin living beside the Tigris, and how water is bound up with her people's traditions and struggles. Another key figure is an adopted hydrologist, Zalikra Clark, who ponders the notion that water might retain memories. The narrative frequently touches on the heartbreak of exiled groups, the dangers they face, and how their stories ripple across time. Shafak's style is quite expansive, brimming with descriptive passages, and occasionally it does drift into magical ideas, such as the notion of a raindrop traveling through centuries. I found the device enchanting, even though the novel can sometimes become overly packed with details. Still, Shafak points out how water shapes civilizations, underscores how crucial it is to us, physically and symbolically. The highlight for me was the depth of empathy shown towards marginalized people, especially the Yazidi. That focus on empathy reminded me how we might similarly widen our empathic reach to consider animals. If water flows across borders, carrying the memory of entire histories, maybe consciousness and the moral weight that goes with it can also extend beyond our species. Now, let's get back to the question. How do we figure out which animals might be conscious? Often, scientists look for behaviors like flexible problem solving, complex communication, and social learning. They also measure neural activity that correlates with the same kinds of integrated processes believed to create consciousness in humans. For instance, in mammals, the presence of a neocortex has been linked to higher cognitive functions. But birds don't have a neocortex, yet some are incredibly smart, like corvids or parrots, suggesting that a differently structured brain might serve similar integrative functions. What about fish, reptiles, or insects? Some researchers argue that fish exhibit responses to painful stimuli and can learn to avoid harmful situations. Critics respond that fish might simply react via nociception, an unfeeling mechanical reflex without any real sensation. The jury is still out, and part of the issue is that fish cannot verbally report what they feel. Even so, many scientists and veterinarians increasingly adopt the position that fish likely experience subjective pain. Whether that extends to, say, insects is even more contested, though certain insects, bees for example, demonstrate advanced communication, memory, and navigation. Some suspect that bees might have a version of subjective awareness, while others say the evidence isn't enough. One reason these topics matter is the moral dimension. If an animal can feel pain or fear in the same sense a human does, then moral caution is warranted in how we treat it. Conversely, those who propose that animals lack subjective experiences sometimes use that to justify using animals for research, food, and so on, without the same moral constraints we apply among humans. Yet, there is also a position that even if animals weren't conscious in the same sense as us, they might still have moral worth based on other considerations. This is part of what makes the philosophical side so intricate. You have layers of argument about consciousness plus layers of argument about ethics, and they don't always perfectly overlap. Personally, I find it helpful to recognize that science has already made huge strides in pushing back ignorance about non-human minds. Once, it was widely accepted that animals acted solely on instinct, mechanical, and unthinking. Nowadays, few hold such a simplistic view. We see ravens solving multi-step puzzles, we see elephants grieving, we see apes learning sign language or symbols. The Cambridge Declaration on Consciousness from 2012 reflects a position that many animals, especially mammals and birds, possess the neurological substrates to generate consciousness. Of course, not everyone endorses that declaration. For instance, Marianne Stamp-Dawkins has pointed out that we still can't be completely certain about consciousness, that it remains an open question, especially as we go further from mammals or birds into fish, reptiles, or invertebrates. So, yes, debates remain. I also want to address something more personal. My worldview urges me to question power structures, hierarchy, and the ways that society often overlooks empathy towards living beings. Without labeling it overtly, I see that position shining through in my reasoning that animals probably have experiences and that we should try to minimize harm. It's a natural extension of believing in shared dignity. Of course, this doesn't mean that I have all the answers. There are complexities, including how we handle an ecosystem shared by predators and prey, how we produce food, or how we conduct necessary medical research. But I do think that acknowledging at least the possibility of subjective experience in animals can change how we weigh those moral dilemmas. pausing for a second, we are in the concluding stretch. After leaving Oslo and continuing forward, we saw tall pine forests, frozen lakes, and a hush in the white winter conditions. Then, after leaving Hamar, we passed through rolling farmlands, the open skies tinted a bit grey around the season, and finally we reach Lillehammer, known for its winter sports legacy. At long last, we find ourselves at the destination. Upon arriving here, I am struck by the crispness of the air, the quiet dignity of the surroundings, and the sense of calm that winter drapes over the region. I hope you've enjoyed this calm, winding reflection on the questions of animal consciousness. We've considered definitions, methods, controversies, and possible moral ramifications. We paused to talk about a few personal interests too. The film Queer by Luca Guadagnino, which made me think about the inner perspective of desire. The TV series Dead Demons, Dededede-Destruction, shining a light on teenage life under cosmic threat. And Elif Shafak's There Are Rivers in the Sky, prompting thoughts about empathy, memory, and the flow of stories across time. Each of these works brought to mind the question of how we see ourselves and how we see others, human or animal, and whether we can sense the deeper worlds within them. What's crucial is that we don't pretend any final conclusion has ever been reached. Animal consciousness remains an open field, full of ongoing investigations. Perhaps the real takeaway is that humility and empathy are wise attitudes to adopt. We share this earth with countless beings. It may be that we barely understand the richness of their inner lives. Then again, we might be reading too much into them. That's part of the riddle. It's also part of what makes it so humbling to think about. So, we've come to the end of this journey together, at least for this episode. It's been a pleasure spending this time with you as we made our way from Thessaloniki to Lillehammer. Thank you for choosing to sit in on this rambling conversation. My question for you is, what should we talk about next time? Which topics should I pick as I set out my next drive? Feel free to share your suggestions. After all, Truck Talk with Liz is just getting started, and I'd love for you to help shape where we go, both geographically and conversationally. For now, I'll sign off, wishing you a serene winter day or evening, wherever you are, whenever you are. May you find a little bit of peace and reflection in your own corner of the world. And until next time, this is Liz Astor, thanking you warmly for joining me on the road. Safe journeys, everyone.